The cold metal floor burned against my cheek as consciousness slowly crept back into my 73-year-old body. My limbs were numb. My breath came out in frozen puffs, and the darkness around me felt like a tomb. I tried to move, but my joints had stiffened like ice. That's when the horrifying reality hit me. I was trapped inside the walk-in freezer of my own restaurant, left here to die by the one person I had trusted most. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, had finally shown her true colors. As hypothermia began to set in, I realized this wasn't an accident. This was murder, calculated and cold, just like the metal walls surrounding me. But what Jessica didn't know was that Virginia Patterson had survived far worse than a spoiled 28-year-old's greed. My name is Virginia Patterson, and if you had told me 3 days ago that I would be fighting for my life in my own restaurant's freezer, I would have called you crazy. I had built Patterson's Family Diner from nothing 45 years ago, working 16-hour days alongside my late husband Robert, until it became the most beloved restaurant in our small Ohio town. When Robert passed away 5 years ago, I poured my grief into that place, making it not just a business but a legacy for my only son, Michael. Michael had always been a gentle soul, perhaps too gentle for his own good. When he brought Jessica home 2 years ago, I tried to see the good in her. She was beautiful, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes that seemed too expensive for someone who claimed to work part-time at a boutique. But beauty can hide the darkest hearts, and I was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way possible. The warning signs had been there for months. Jessica's constant complaints about our modest lifestyle, her subtle suggestions that I should retire and let her and Michael take over the restaurant, her calculating eyes whenever I mentioned my will. She had married my son for one reason only: money, my money. The restaurant was worth over $2 million, and my personal savings added another $500,000 to that. For a gold digger like Jessica, that was more than enough reason to eliminate the obstacle standing between her and her prize. The plan had been carefully orchestrated. Michael was away on a business trip, something that rarely happened, but Jessica had insisted he attend this particular conference. She had volunteered to help me with the evening inventory, something she had never shown interest in before. I should have been suspicious, but I was so desperate for a connection with my daughter-in-law that I ignored my instincts. We had been checking the freezer inventory when Jessica stepped behind me. I remember turning to ask her about some missing steaks when everything went black. She had struck me with something heavy. Later, I would find the metal inventory clipboard covered in my blood. When I woke up, I was locked inside the freezer with no way out. But Jessica had made one crucial mistake. She underestimated the woman who had built an empire with her bare hands. As I lay there in that freezing tomb, feeling my body temperature drop dangerously low, my mind became crystal clear. This wasn't just about surviving the cold. This was about surviving long enough to make her pay for what she had done to me and what she was planning to do to my son. The freezer was designed to lock from the outside for security, but Robert and I had installed an emergency release mechanism years ago after reading about restaurant accidents. Jessica didn't know about the small lever hidden behind the ventilation grate. The problem was I needed to reach it, and my body was shutting down from the cold. I forced myself to move, dragging my stiffening limbs across the icy floor. Every inch was agony, but the rage burning in my chest kept me going. I thought about Jessica, probably already celebrating my death, maybe even planning my funeral while she seduced my grieving son into signing over everything. That image gave me the strength I needed. After what felt like hours, my frozen fingers found the release lever. The mechanism was stiff from the cold, but decades of hard work had made my hands strong. I pulled with everything I had left, and finally, blessedly, I heard the lock click open. I stumbled out of the freezer and into the dark restaurant, my body shaking uncontrollably. The clock on the wall showed 3:17 a.m. I had been in there for nearly 6 hours. Jessica had left me there to die, probably planning to discover my body the next morning and play the grieving daughter-in-law. But I was alive, and now the real game was about to begin. Jessica thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman, but she was about to learn that Virginia Patterson was far from helpless. As I reached for the phone to call for help, a new thought occurred to me. What if I didn't call for help right away? What if I let Jessica think her plan had worked? The wheels in my mind began to turn as I realized I had been given the perfect opportunity for revenge. Jessica wanted me dead? Fine. Let her think I was dead. Let her show her true colors to Michael and the whole town. And when the time was right, I would rise from the grave like a vengeful ghost to claim everything that was rightfully mine. Standing there in my own restaurant, hypothermic and battered but very much alive, I began to plan the most satisfying revenge of my 73 years. Jessica had awakened something dangerous in me, something that had been sleeping since Robert's death. She wanted to play with fire, and now she was going to burn. The first rule of revenge is patience, and I had learned patience through 5 decades of marriage and business. Instead of going to the hospital or calling the police, I drove my old Buick to the one place I knew I could disappear. My sister Helen's cabin in the woods, 30 miles outside of town. Helen had passed away last year, but I kept the place maintained as a retreat. It would be perfect for what I had in mind. I spent the next 2 days recovering and planning. My body ached from the hypothermia, and the gash on my head where Jessica had struck me needed attention. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I had security cameras throughout the restaurant, including one hidden camera that Robert had installed in the freezer after a previous break-in. If Jessica thought she had committed the perfect crime, she was about to learn how wrong she was. On the 3rd day, I heard the news on the radio. Local restaurant owner Virginia Patterson reported missing after failing to open her establishment for 2 consecutive days. The report mentioned that my daughter-in-law, Jessica, had contacted police after becoming concerned for my welfare. I almost laughed at the performance. Jessica was playing her role perfectly, and she had no idea she was digging her own grave. I waited until evening before making my move. Using the back roads I knew like the back of my hand, I drove to the restaurant under cover of darkness. The place was sealed with police tape, but I knew every entrance and exit. More importantly, I knew where the security system's backup drives were hidden, something even the police hadn't discovered yet. Getting inside unseen was easier than expected. The investigation was treating this as a missing person case, not a crime scene, so security was minimal. I made my way to the hidden panel behind the office refrigerator where Robert and I had installed our backup security system. The drives contained everything: Jessica's arrival, our conversation, her following me to the freezer, and most damning of all, her leaving the restaurant alone while I was trapped inside. But the real prize was what the cameras had captured the next morning. Jessica had returned to the restaurant at 7 a.m., right on schedule to discover my disappearance. The footage showed her checking to make sure I wasn't in the freezer, her face showing not relief that it was empty, but disappointment. She had expected to find a body, and when she didn't, her carefully planned grief performance became genuine panic. Armed with this evidence, I could have gone straight to the police and ended everything. But that would have been too easy, too clean. Jessica deserved to suffer the way she had made me suffer. She deserved to feel the fear and helplessness that came with knowing your life was in someone else's hands. I began my campaign of psychological warfare slowly. First, I sent anonymous letters to Jessica's friends, revealing some of her more embarrassing secrets: her real age, her previous marriages, the debt she had hidden from Michael. Nothing illegal, just enough to make her social circle start questioning who she really was. Then I started appearing in places where she would glimpse me, but couldn't be sure. A figure in the back of the grocery store that looked familiar. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat sitting 3 rows behind her at church. Each sighting made her more paranoid, more unstable. I watched from a distance as she started jumping at shadows, constantly looking over her shoulder. The beauty of my plan was that everyone assumed I was dead or missing. When Jessica tried to tell people she thought she was seeing me, they looked at her with pity and concern. Poor Jessica, so traumatized by her mother-in-law's disappearance that she was hallucinating. Michael, who had rushed home from his business trip, was so consumed with grief and guilt that he couldn't see what was happening to his wife. But I was just getting started. Through my network of friends and employees, I began spreading rumors about Jessica's past, how she had been married twice before, and both previous husbands had died under mysterious circumstances. How she had been asking questions about my will and insurance policies. How she had been seen with another man while Michael was out of town. None of it was completely true, but the best lies always contain a grain of truth. Jessica's behavior became increasingly erratic as her reputation crumbled around her. She started drinking heavily, something Michael couldn't ignore. She became paranoid and accusatory, lashing out at anyone who tried to help her. The turning point came when I decided to pay a visit to my own funeral. Jessica had convinced Michael to hold a memorial service despite the fact that no body had been found. She played the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly, sobbing into her black handkerchief and accepting condolences from the entire town. What she didn't notice was the woman in dark sunglasses sitting in the very back pew, watching every move she made. During the service, Jessica gave a beautiful eulogy about what a wonderful woman I had been, and how much she would miss me. She talked about my generosity, my kindness, and how I had welcomed her into the family with open arms. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but I sat there and listened to every word, memorizing them for later use. After the service, as people gathered for the reception, I made my move. I had prepared a special gift for Jessica, a recording of her own voice, taken from the restaurant's security footage, saying some very unflattering things about me and the rest of the family. I had edited it into a short audio clip that I left playing on repeat in her car stereo. When Jessica got into her car after the reception, she was greeted by her own voice calling me a stubborn old witch who needed to die already. The recording was clear enough that anyone could have heard it, and several mourners were still in the parking lot. The look of horror on her face as she frantically tried to turn off the stereo was worth every cold hour I had spent in that freezer. But Jessica was smarter than I had given her credit for. Instead of panicking completely, she began to suspect that I was still alive. She started asking questions, hiring a private investigator to look into my disappearance. She even went back to the restaurant and searched for clues, though she didn't find the evidence I had already removed. Her suspicions made her dangerous, and I realized that my game of cat and mouse was about to become much more serious. Jessica was no longer just a gold digger trying to steal my money. She was a cornered animal fighting for her survival. And cornered animals, as I knew from years of living in rural Ohio, were capable of anything. As I watched her from my hiding place, planning my next move, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. The real battle was just beginning, and I intended to win it. Jessica wanted to play deadly games. She had picked the wrong woman to mess with. Virginia Patterson was about to teach her a lesson she would never forget, assuming she lived long enough to remember it. Jessica's paranoia had reached a boiling point, and I could see it was affecting Michael deeply. My son had lost weight, his once bright eyes now hollow with grief and confusion as he watched his wife spiral into madness. Part of me ached seeing him like this, but I knew that exposing Jessica's true nature was the only way to save him from a lifetime of manipulation and eventual danger. The private investigator Jessica hired was named David Morrison, a former police detective with a reputation for being thorough. I had known David's father years ago, and I decided it was time to make contact. Not with Jessica, but with David himself. If she wanted to investigate my disappearance, I would make sure he found exactly what I wanted him to find. I arranged to meet David at a small diner 2 towns over, wearing a disguise that would fool casual observers, but not a trained investigator. When he walked in, I could see the recognition dawn on his face immediately. Virginia Patterson, the supposedly missing woman he had been hired to find, sitting calmly in a corner booth with a cup of coffee. I told David everything: the attack, the freezer, the evidence I had collected, and my plan for revenge. What I didn't expect was his reaction. Instead of trying to convince me to go to the police immediately, he listened carefully, and then made a proposition that changed everything. David had been investigating Jessica longer than she knew. Her previous husbands hadn't died of natural causes as the death certificates claimed. Richard Thompson, husband number 1, had died of a heart attack at 35 with no history of heart problems. James Mitchell, husband number 2, had fallen down the stairs and broken his neck just 6 months after their wedding. Both men had life insurance policies that Jessica had collected on, and both had changed their wills shortly before their deaths. Jessica wasn't just a gold digger, she was a serial killer, and Michael was her next target. David had been building a case against her for months, but he needed more evidence. My supposed death was actually the final piece of the puzzle he had been waiting for. We formed an unlikely partnership. David would continue working for Jessica, feeding her false information and keeping her distracted, while I gathered the evidence needed to expose her crimes. The plan was dangerous, but it was also brilliant. Jessica thought she was hunting a ghost, but she was actually being hunted by two very real and very determined people. The first phase involved setting up Jessica for a confession. David convinced her that he had found evidence I was still alive and hiding somewhere in the area. He suggested that if she could find me and finish what she started, all her problems would disappear. The conversation was recorded, of course, and Jessica's response was everything we needed to hear. She not only admitted to attacking me and leaving me in the freezer, but she also revealed details about her previous husband's deaths that only the killer could know. She described how she had used digitalis from her garden foxgloves to cause Richard's heart attack, and how she had pushed James down the stairs after drugging him with sleeping pills. The woman I had welcomed into my family was a monster, and now we had proof. But Jessica was becoming increasingly unstable, and her desperation made her unpredictable. When David told her he had tracked me to Helen's old cabin, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a gun from a private seller, using cash and a fake ID that David later told me she had used before. Jessica Patterson was coming to kill Virginia Patterson, and this time she planned to make sure the job was done right. I was ready for her. The cabin was isolated, but I had prepared it like a fortress. Every entrance was monitored, every room had multiple exit strategies, and I had called in a favor from my nephew Tommy, a veteran who owed me more than he could ever repay. Tommy and his military buddies were positioned around the property, invisible but vigilant, ready to move if things went wrong. When Jessica arrived at the cabin that cold November night, she thought she was walking into a trap where she was the hunter. She had no idea she was actually walking into her own execution. I watched from the window as she parked her car and checked her gun, her hands shaking with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had dressed all in black, like some kind of movie assassin, but her amateur mistakes were obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. She left her car door open for a quick escape. She approached from the most obvious angle, and she had no idea that there were already people watching her every move. When she kicked open the cabin door, gun raised and ready to kill, I was sitting calmly in the living room rocking chair, knitting needles in my hands instead of a weapon. The look of shock on her face was priceless. She had expected to find me hiding, cowering, afraid. Instead, she found me waiting, composed, and completely in control of the situation. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jessica and I were face to face with no pretense between us. She could see that I knew exactly who and what she was, and I could see the pure evil that had been hiding behind her pretty smile for 2 years. We stared at each other across that small room, predator and prey, though she still didn't realize which one of us was which. Jessica raised the gun, her voice shaking as she demanded to know how I had survived and why I hadn't gone to the police. I told her the truth, that I had wanted to see just how far she would go, how much she would reveal about her true nature. I told her about David, about the recordings, about the evidence of her previous murders. The color drained from her face as she realized that her carefully constructed life was about to collapse around her. But instead of surrendering, instead of begging for mercy, Jessica Patterson chose to double down on her evil. She pulled the trigger, aiming straight for my heart, fully intending to commit her 4th murder right there in that remote cabin. What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her very short life. The gun didn't fire. I had anticipated her move and had Tommy disable the weapon while she was breaking in. As Jessica stood there clicking the trigger frantically, the cabin suddenly filled with armed men, red laser sights dancing across her body from every angle. But I wasn't done with her yet. Jessica had caused me pain, fear, and anguish beyond measure. She had tried to kill me twice and had murdered 2 innocent men. She had manipulated my son and nearly destroyed my life's work. A quick arrest and a lifetime in prison wasn't enough punishment for what she had done to me and my family. Looking at her terrified face as she realized she was completely trapped, I smiled for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Jessica wanted to play deadly games. She had picked the perfect opponent. But now the game was ending, and there could be only one winner. Virginia Patterson was about to teach Jessica the most important lesson of her life, and the last lesson she would ever learn. The terror in Jessica's eyes as she realized she was completely trapped was almost enough to satisfy my need for revenge. Almost, but not quite. She had put me through hell, and I intended to return the favor before justice finally caught up with her. Tommy and his friends secured Jessica while David called the police, but I asked them to wait just a little longer. I needed Jessica to understand the full scope of what she had lost, what she had thrown away for her greed and evil. More importantly, I needed her to confess everything on record, not just for the courts, but for Michael. My son deserved to hear the truth from her own lips. With the guns pointed at her and no escape possible, Jessica finally dropped her act entirely. The sweet, innocent daughter-in-law facade crumbled away, revealing the cold-blooded killer underneath. She laughed, actually laughed, as she told me how easy it had been to fool everyone, how pathetic she thought I was, how she had planned to kill Michael too, once she had secured everything. She described in detail how she had researched my family, learned about the restaurant's value, and set her sights on Michael as her next victim. She had been patient, playing the loving wife for 2 years while she laid the groundwork for her ultimate plan. Michael's business trip hadn't been a coincidence. She had arranged for him to be away so she could eliminate me without witnesses. But Jessica's biggest mistake was revealing what she had planned next. She told me, with obvious pride in her cleverness, how Michael was going to have a terrible accident very soon after my funeral. A gas leak in their home, maybe, or perhaps a car accident on one of those dangerous mountain roads he liked to drive. She had already researched the best methods, just like she had with her previous husbands. Hearing her casual discussion of murdering my only child broke something inside me. The rage I had been carefully controlling throughout this entire ordeal finally erupted. I stood up from my rocking chair and walked over to where she sat bound in a kitchen chair, my knitting needles still clutched in my arthritic hands. Jessica's confident smirk faltered when she saw my face. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of the guns pointed at her, not of the police who would soon arrive, but of me. Of a 73-year-old woman whose family she had threatened, whose life she had tried to steal, whose son she had planned to murder. I leaned down close to her ear and whispered the words that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. I told her exactly what was going to happen next, how her arrest would unfold, how the evidence would be presented, how her previous crimes would be exposed. I described the media attention, the trial, the other families of her victims who would finally have justice. But most importantly, I told her about Michael. How he would learn the truth about what she really was. How he would realize that every kiss, every "I love you," every moment of intimacy had been part of her plan to kill him. I watched her face crumble as she understood that the one person who had genuinely loved her, who had believed in her goodness, would spend the rest of his life knowing he had shared his bed with a monster. The police arrived 20 minutes later, led by Detective Sarah Mitchell, no relation to Jessica's second victim. Just an unfortunate coincidence that seemed to shake Jessica even more. David handed over all the evidence we had collected, including the security footage, the recorded confessions, and the research he had done into her previous murders. As they led Jessica away in handcuffs, she looked back at me one last time. The hatred in her eyes was pure and undiluted, but there was something else there too, a grudging respect. She had underestimated me completely, and we both knew it. Virginia Patterson, the stubborn old witch she had tried to eliminate, had outplayed her at every turn. The media descended on our small town like locusts. "Black Widow killer caught by intended victim," read the headlines. My picture was everywhere, but I didn't mind the attention. For too long, women like Jessica had gotten away with their crimes because people underestimated what older women were capable of. I had proven that age and appearance could be the perfect disguise for a sharp mind and an iron will. Michael took the revelations hard, as I had expected he would. Learning that the woman he loved had planned to murder him was devastating, but learning that she had already killed 2 other men who had loved her was almost worse. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs, for bringing her into our family, for leaving me alone with her that night. I spent hours with my son, helping him understand that he had been a victim too, that Jessica's manipulation had been expert and calculated. She had chosen him specifically because he was kind and trusting, because his gentle nature made him easy to control. There was no shame in being deceived by someone who had made deception their life's work. The trial preparation took months, but I was involved in every step. The prosecutors built their case around my testimony and David's investigation, but they also brought in experts on Jessica's previous crimes. The pattern was clear and undeniable. She had been killing for money for at least 6 years, possibly longer. Jessica's defense team tried to paint me as vindictive, suggesting that I had orchestrated an elaborate revenge plot instead of simply going to the police. They weren't wrong, but they missed the point entirely. If I had gone to the police immediately, Jessica might have found a way to escape justice, just as she had twice before. By forcing her to reveal her true nature, by making her desperate enough to confess everything, I had ensured that she would never hurt anyone again. The trial itself was a media circus, but I was ready for it. I had been preparing for this moment since that night in the freezer, and I wasn't going to let Jessica escape justice because of some clever lawyer's tricks. When I took the stand, I told my story simply and directly, letting the facts speak for themselves. Jessica's conviction was never really in doubt, but the sentence was what mattered most to me. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and a dozen other charges related to fraud and identity theft. The judge, a woman about my age who had clearly seen enough evil in her courtroom, sentenced Jessica to life without parole. But even as Jessica was led away to begin her sentence, I could see in her eyes that she wasn't done with me. Prison wouldn't reform her. It would only make her more cunning, more dangerous. Women like Jessica never truly accepted defeat, and I had a feeling that our story wasn't over yet. Standing outside the courthouse that day, watching the news crews pack up their equipment and the crowds disperse, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any I had ever experienced. Justice had been served, my son was safe, and Jessica Patterson would spend the rest of her life paying for her crimes. But satisfaction and peace are 2 different things, and as I would soon learn, some enemies are more dangerous in defeat than they ever were in victory. Jessica had friends, connections, resources that even prison couldn't fully contain, and she had something else that worried me more than anything: time to plan her next move. 6 months after Jessica's conviction, I thought I could finally return to some semblance of normal life. The restaurant had reopened with Michael as the official owner, though I still helped with the day-to-day operations. The media attention had died down, and our small town was slowly returning to its peaceful routine. I should have known that peace would be temporary when dealing with someone like Jessica Patterson. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter delivered to the restaurant. No return address, postmarked from the state prison where Jessica was serving her sentence. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in Jessica's careful handwriting. Old women die from so many natural causes. Age, accidents, heart attacks. It would be such a shame if something happened to you before I get out of here. I showed the letter to Detective Mitchell, but there wasn't much she could do. Prisoners sending threatening mail wasn't unusual, and Jessica was already serving life without parole. The letter was documented and filed away, but I could see in the detective's eyes that she was worried too. Women like Jessica didn't make idle threats. The next incident was more subtle but infinitely more dangerous. I woke up one morning feeling dizzy and nauseous, symptoms I initially attributed to working too hard despite my age. But when the same symptoms appeared after eating lunch at the restaurant, I began to suspect something more sinister. Dr. Williams, who had been my physician for 30 years, ran every test he could think of. The results showed traces of arsenic in my blood, not enough to kill me immediately, but enough to make me sick and create the appearance of natural decline in an elderly woman. Someone was slowly poisoning me, and we all knew who was behind it. The investigation revealed that Jessica had maintained contact with several people from her past life, including a former cellmate who had been released just weeks after Jessica's conviction. Maria Santos had served time for assault and had skills that made her valuable to someone planning murder from behind bars. Finding her became the police's top priority, but Maria was already gone, vanished into the network of criminals and drifters that exists in every state. The poisoning stopped, but I knew this was just the beginning. Jessica had proven she could reach me even from prison, and she had made it clear that my death was still her primary goal. Michael wanted me to leave town, to disappear somewhere Jessica couldn't find me. But I had built my life in this place, and I wasn't about to let a convicted killer drive me away from everything I had worked for. Instead, I decided to take the fight directly to Jessica herself. Visiting someone in maximum security prison requires approval and scheduling, but I had connections that Jessica didn't know about. Tommy's military background included intelligence work, and he knew people who could arrange special visits for security consultations. Within a week, I was sitting across from Jessica Patterson in a sterile prison conference room, separated by bulletproof glass, but finally face to face for the first time since her arrest. She looked different in her prison uniform, smaller somehow, but the evil in her eyes was unchanged. When she saw me walk into that room, healthy and very much alive despite her poisoning attempt, her mask of indifference slipped for just a moment. I saw surprise, frustration, and something that might have been respect. We talked for 2 hours, though talked might not be the right word. Jessica made threats, I made promises. She told me about her connections, her resources, her plans for continuing to make my life hell even from behind bars. I told her about my own connections, my resources, and my plans for making sure she never succeeded. The conversation revealed something important that changed everything. Jessica wasn't just after revenge anymore. She was after money. Her conviction had frozen her assets and left her with massive legal bills. Her life insurance policies from her previous murders had been seized by the courts. She was desperate for funds to finance her operations against me and to pay the people helping her. That desperation gave me an idea for the perfect revenge, one that would neutralize Jessica permanently while giving justice to all her victims. I had spent months reacting to her moves, but now it was time to take the offensive. Working with David Morrison and a team of financial investigators, I traced every asset Jessica had ever controlled. The money she had inherited from her murdered husbands, the insurance payouts, the property she had acquired through fraud, all of it was connected in a web of shell companies and hidden accounts that she thought were untouchable. But Jessica had underestimated the power of patient, methodical investigation. Over the next 3 months, we unraveled her entire financial empire. Every hidden account was exposed. Every fraudulent transaction was documented. Every penny she had stolen was tracked back to its source. The final phase of my revenge was both simple and devastating. Using the civil courts, I helped the families of Jessica's previous victims file wrongful death lawsuits against her estate. The evidence from her criminal trial made these cases slam dunks, and the judgments were massive. Combined with the restitution orders from her criminal conviction, Jessica's debts now exceeded $10 million. Every asset she had accumulated through murder and fraud was seized to pay these judgments. The houses, the cars, the jewelry, the bank accounts, everything was sold at auction with the proceeds going to her victims' families. Jessica Patterson, who had killed 3 people for money, was left with absolutely nothing. But the best part was yet to come. Under federal law, prisoners are required to pay restitution from any income they receive, including money sent by friends or family. Any attempt by Jessica to fund further attacks against me would result in that money being seized to pay her victims. She was trapped in a financial prison even more secure than her physical one. The final nail in Jessica's coffin came when her remaining criminal contacts abandoned her. Without money to pay them, without assets to offer as collateral, she became worthless to the people who had been helping her. Maria Santos was arrested in Arizona, and she quickly gave up Jessica in exchange for a reduced sentence. The poisoning plot was exposed, adding another 10 years to Jessica's sentence and eliminating any possibility of parole. 6 months later, I received one final letter from Jessica. This one was different, shorter, simpler, and somehow more frightening than her previous threats. It contained just 4 words: "I will never stop." I wrote back immediately, my response even shorter than hers. "Neither will I." But the truth was, I didn't need to keep fighting anymore. Jessica Patterson was finished, destroyed by the very greed and evil that had driven her to crime in the first place. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, penniless and powerless, while her victims' families finally had both justice and compensation for their losses. Standing in my restaurant kitchen that evening, watching Michael laugh with customers and seeing the joy return to his face, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. The nightmare was over. My family was safe, and justice had been served in ways the courts could never have managed alone. Jessica had tried to kill me for my money, but in the end, it was money that killed her dreams of revenge. She had underestimated Virginia Patterson one final time, and that mistake had cost her everything she had ever valued. Sometimes the best revenge isn't violence or death. Sometimes it's simply ensuring that evil gets exactly what it deserves. Nothing at all.